introduce. I'm Andrew, and
My name is Stephanie.
Hello, Andrew and Stephanie.
great. So we have with us today Lorraine Daston, who is the director of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. Thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure.
So I wanted to start off with a pretty simple question, and that is the category of scientific objects brings to mind a wide range of different examples, things that are vast and things that are minute, things that are very tangible, things that are intangible, like dreams. So what is a scientific object? What are sort of the factors that underlie and bring together these different examples?
I don't think there's any single criterion that is a necessary and sufficient condition for an everyday or not so everyday object becoming an object of scientific inquiry. Here are some of the candidates for such criteria. One might simply be the possibility of yielding robust effects or ironclad regularities, and that's probably why astronomy has been, since very ancient times and in several cultures, an object of science in which the stars have been an object of scientific inquiry. But then there are objects of scientific inquiry which are at the opposite end of the spectrum. For example, many of the objects of social scientific inquiry, which are notoriously evanescent, fickle, difficult to replicate, the very opposite of those ironclad regularities of the heavenly bodies. For example, relationships of inequality, gender, race, and class. But because they're invested with so much societal and political meaning, they too become objects of scientific inquiry.
Great.
I see. But when we think about the history of science and the study of history of science, we don't necessarily think of scientific objects. So how did you become interested in scientific objects in the first place?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I can give you an interesting answer to it. I think certainly what must have contributed to this line of reflection was the fact that Katie Park and I, when we were writing an article about monsters a long, long time ago when both of us were in graduate school, encountered an enormous amount of bafflement on the part of our teachers and indeed our fellow students as to what this had to do with the history of science. And that is because although the annals of scientific societies of the 17th century are full of articles about monsters, you cannot read a major text by Leibniz or Locke, or even in some cases Galileo or Newton without encountering a marvel of some kind or another. These disappeared as an object of scientific inquiry. So I think that must have prodded me in the direction of reflecting on how objects of scientific inquiry come into being and pass away.
Great. So now, thinking about the history of science generally, what do we gain by doing a history of scientific objects? What does a history of scientific objects bring to the table, or how does it change things when we do the history of science, focusing on this in particular?
I think that there are a number of ways in which a focus on the objects of inquiry has at least the potential to unsettle some assumptions about the history of science. So the history of science has, for most of its existence, been structured as a history of individual scientific disciplines. And the map of those disciplines has been given, usually without further critical scrutiny, as the current map of the disciplines, the map that's familiar to you from the classifications of books in the library and the steps that your feet trace between various buildings on a university campus. That is, you are not surprised to find that the astronomy and physics departments have a great deal to do with one another, and that both of them are relatively remote, both physically and intellectually, from the music department. But any medievalist can tell you that the quadrivium of the medieval university would have put astronomy, music, arithmetic, geometry optics together, but that physics would have been much closer to philosophy. By studying the objects of the sciences rather than the sciences themselves, especially in their current disciplinary incarnation, you're immediately led to remap the disciplines and their relationships. So that's one way in which a study of objects of scientific inquiry has at least the potential to explode a number of thoughtlessly anachronistic assumptions about how to do the history of science. Another perhaps even deeper way in which it might undermine assumptions about how to do the history of science is that these objects of scientific inquiry are not permanent. And it takes very special circumstances in order for them to light up like neon as objects of scientific inquiry. They may remain, both before and after their efflorescence as objects of scientific inquiry, everyday objects. But as I say, it takes a very special conjunction of circumstances in order for them to become magnetic for sustained scientific inquiry. That immediately points us toward the contingencies in the history of science and the thought that the history of science could have been otherwise, given how locomotive-like most of the grand narratives in the history of science have been, a kind of train hurtling toward its well-known destination, the end station of what we know now. That, I think, is an extremely salutary lesson to learn from focusing on the history of the objects of scientific inquiry.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually something that we found very interesting, the idea that scientific objects, they become scientific objects, and equally they may fade away as scientific objects as well. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this process? How does an object or a phenomenon, how does it become a scientific object? Is it based on our perception of it, our understanding of the object itself? What determines this sort of process of transformation?
As I said, I don't think there's any single answer to that. I think there are several answers, and it will depend very much on the object and the circumstances. As I say, perhaps the most obvious and the most philosophically understandable way in which an everyday object, an object of everyday observation, is transformed into a scientific object is the potential for yielding either very stable phenomenological regularities and these two do not necessarily go together, a causal explanation. And one way of thinking about that is that since ancient Mesopotamia, there were very strong observational regularities yielded by celestial observation, but the causal account of those observations, why they were so stable, waited until the late 17th century. So that's one way in which objects can be transformed. Another is that they are suddenly seen to be part of a larger pattern, so that one looks, for example, at the unbelievable, blooming, buzzing confusion of natural history. Natural history is a cornucopia of variability. There's almost nothing that you can think of a great deal that you can't think of that isn't manifested in one species or another. The most fertile imagination of a science fiction writer probably cannot replicate the bizarrerie of the insect world. But when a new way of looking at that variability, for example, in terms of natural selection, is articulated, then suddenly something which previously had not been a particularly salient object of a scientific inquiry, namely reproduction and reproductive success, becomes a scarlet thread that runs through all of natural history and can be studied regardless of how very different the species are in other respects. So that's another way in which, as I say, a new object, that is reproduction and reproductive success, can become an object of scientific inquiry. But one shouldn't forget the obverse of this coin. Robert Proctor and London Schiebinger have talked about agnotology, which is those objects which pointedly are not the objects of sustained scientific inquiry, and pointed out that in many cases there may be political reasons for obscuring certain kinds of objects. I believe Londa Schiebinger's is about breast cancer in the 1970s and 80s. Her example may make them either extremely minor objects of scientific inquiry or erase them entirely from the radar screen of scientific consciousness.
So now I was thinking sort of about the history of scientific objects, if you will. So I imagine that scientific objects in a scientific museum goes back for a long time, but this is different from doing it in a historical way. It's sort of stripped of its context. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on this difference between a scientific object presented in a museum and then when the scientific object was brought into the history of science.
Right. So of course, not all objects can be put in a display case. So that's one obvious difference between the objects of a scientific collection and objects of scientific inquiry. So the objects of a scientific collection are a subset of a much larger genus of objects of scientific inquiry. But the objects in a museum are not there by accident. And they are part of an attempt, as it were, to bring nature indoors and to make objects which wouldn't really be full-fledged objects of scientific inquiry in the wild, to make them such in the museum or perhaps the laboratory. So let me give you a concrete example of that. The science of botany is a very old science, especially in its alliance with medicine since ancient times. But it's only in the early 16th century that at the University of Pisa in northern Italy, the technique of herbarium preservation is invented. That is, you take a plant that you've gathered in the wild, you press it, and you glue it onto the page of a book. What this makes possible is, first of all, the preservation of a species, including that exemplar of the species, which may be the very first in a new classification, the very first exemplum of a new species or a new genus. What it also makes possible is comparison, and comparison not only in the collection of a particular botanist, but potentially, this is the case with Linnaeus's herbarium, which is still kept in London in a strong room protected from water and fire and probably World War III, comparison with all other herbaria in the world whenever there is a classificatory question that must be clarified. So these objects, which are museum objects, are transformed by a very subtle but also material process into objects of scientific inquiry that make it possible to study plants in ways which would not be possible if you were simply studying them in the field.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It was great to chat with you.
Yes, absolutely. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure the students as well, they'll be very happy to see you and to hear from you. We certainly were. So thank you.
Thanks so much.